Disclosure: I was invited by the Panzermuseum Munster. The Panzer IV was not, as so often claimed, the workhorse of the Wehrmacht. I myself made the error in the past. Thankfully, Dr. Jens Wehner made me aware of this. He has a German YouTube channel, by the way. In this video we look at data about the production and deployment of the Panzer IV. Additionally, we also look at the Allied tanks as well. Yet why is this important? Well, the whole workhorse of the Wehrmacht comes with a large bag of implicit assumptions that give us a wrong impression of the war from the tactical to the industrial level. First, the Panzer IV was not the most bruised German armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War, that was the Sturmgeschütz. Second, if one looks at the deployment numbers, the Panzer IV is only a few times the most deployed tank at all. Sometimes it is even one of the lesser deployed ones. Third, one could argue it was the most produced tank, so with a turret, of the Germans, but even there the lead is not particularly significant and does not even come close to the dominance of the T-34 or Sherman in Allied service. Let us start with the production numbers. There were about 8,515 Panzer IV produced from 1937 to 1945, but if you look at the Panther, which was only produced in the last 3 years of the war, so from 1943 to 1945, 5,984 were produced, which is closely followed by the Panzer III with 5,681. At first this seems to confirm the workhorse of the Wehrmacht statement, yet considering how long the Panzer IV was in production, the lead seems to be rather short. This becomes particularly apparent if compared to the Panther production. You notice that the far heavier and bigger Panther was rolled out in comparable high numbers. Yet just looking at the Panzer IV production over time, you see some interesting patterns. Even in 1942, so several years into the war, only a bit less than 1,000 were produced. Only in 1943, almost 3,000 were produced. And then the production peaked in 1944 with 3,125, but in the same year it was overtaken by the Panther with 3,777 produced. Compared with all the other tanks, only in 1943, so 1 year out of 7 or 9 years if you count peacetime, the Panzer IV was the most produced German tank. Let us put those numbers also into an international context, namely with the T-34 and Sherman. For this I summed up German tank production of regular tanks, so no assault guns, command tanks, flag tanks, etc. from 1934 to 1945. For the Soviet Union and the United States, I did the same, although from 1940 to 1945, whereby the 1945 data also includes post-war production. This is not perfect, but it is about seeing what percentage the workhorses of each faction were. For the US, the Stuart takes up about 18.4%, meanwhile the Sherman with the 75mm gun just 43.2%, but if we sum up the M4 with the 75, the M4 with the 76, and the 105mm, we get 63%. One could argue that the M4 105mm is technically an assault gun. If we remove it, the number for the Sherman with the 75 and 76 summed up goes to 60.9%, and the Stuart goes up to almost 20%. So still no major change here. Next is the Soviet Union. Here every tank except the T-34 takes up less than 10%. The third most produced tank, the T-70, has just 6.9%. The T-34 with the 76mm gun makes up 41.6% and the T-34-85 about 27.2%. If we combine those two, we get 68%, so more than 2/3. The chassis is mostly the same, but the turret and gun was different. So one could argue about it. A compromise could be that we divide 27.2 by 2 and add it to the 41.6%, which would be 55.2%, so more than half of the total production. Now let's compare these numbers to the German numbers. Here the Panzer IV makes up 31.7%, followed by the Panther with 22.3%, and the Panzer III with 22.2%. So the Panzer IV barely makes up 1/3 of all Panzers produced. So even if we combine the Panzer III and IV production, this would mean 52.9%. This is a lower percentage than for the Sherman 75 and 76 combined, or the T-34 76 and T-34 85 combined. Only if you take the T-34 76 or Sherman 75 alone, the Panzer IV comes close to the Allied percentages. But still with about 10% difference, and in this case one has to ask if we also have to split up the Panzer IV in 2 to 3 variants, since the 75mm guns had 3 different caliber lengths, 24, 43 and finally 48. These numbers clearly show that the Panzer IV was far less dominant in the German tank forces than the Allied tanks it is commonly compared to. That were the real workhorses of the subsequent forces. It makes it also apparent how distributed or better unfocused German tank production was in terms of types compared to the Allies, particularly with the Soviets. Of course, one might argue this looks differently if we only accounted for wartime production. Well, here's the chart for 1939 to 1945. As you can see, there are still 3 tanks that are produced in large numbers, while the other tanks make up about 5% or less. For those that note I should exclude the German Panzer I and II, or that I should remove the pre-war production, I tested this, it only changes the number a bit. Namely, the Panzer IV percentage goes up to 36.3% without the Panzer I and II, and to 34.8% without the production data from 1934 to 1938. Yet excluding them I think would be wrong, since for Germany's tanks and production years were far more important than for the Soviet Union and the United States. Why is this relevant? Because it shows that the German production was clearly not as streamlined as the term workhorse of the Wehrmacht suggests. Mass production takes time to become more efficient, and for the Panzer IV the numbers suggest that the sweet spot might have been reached but never been really exploited. If we look at just the mass production aspect, the Panther actually would be the most important tank in regard, considering that it was the second most produced German tank, while only produced from 1943 onward. Yet if one looks at deployment numbers, it becomes even more apparent how absent the Panzer IV was so often from the battlefield, particularly in the first 4 years of the war. As you can see here, in Poland, out of 2,800 Panzers, just short of 200 were Panzer IVs. That is a bit less than 7%. In France 1940, out of 2,574 Panzers, 278 are Panzer IVs. That is a bit less than 11%. For Operation Barbarossa in 1941, out of 3,266 Panzers, 439 were Panzer IVs, which is more than 13%. So for each operation less than 15%, for Poland even less than 10%. That is a rather lame or absent workhorse, if you ask me. By the way, an interesting detail, if you look at the intended layout of the medium tank company, it was intended with 3 platoons of 4 Panzer IVs each, but for Operation Barbarossa the companies only received 2 platoons. The 3rd platoon was not authorized. So they only had 10 instead of 14 Panzer IVs in the medium company. And the medium companies were in a ratio of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 to the light companies, since the Panzer divisions had several layouts. So 2 to 3 light companies for each medium company per battalion in 1941. If you want to learn more about the medium company and how it should be employed, check out our translation of the German Army Regulation. It contains the original text and plenty of footnotes and a glossary for all the important terminology. Anyway, let's move on to 1942. Well, for summer 1942, the numbers for the Ostfront are as follows, according to Jens and Doyle. Note that the type of command tanks was not specified, but they account only for 2.6%. As you can see, the most numerous tank is the Panzer III with 51%, followed by the Panzer II with 16.6%, only then with 15.8% the Panzer IV, which is barely ahead of the Panzer 38T with 14%. Keep in mind here that the Panzer IIIs and IVs are summed up here. For both, there were short and long-barreled versions, and the Panzer IVs with the long-barreled 75mm gun only accounted for 5.8%, whereas 10% was the version with the short-barreled gun. This is not surprising if you consider the production numbers, since in 1942 the Panzer III was still produced 2.6 times more than the Panzer IVs. Yet what happens if we look at the greatest tank battle in World War II, the Battle of Kursk in 1943? Note that these numbers don't include Sturmgeschütze, Sturmpanzer or similar vehicles, only turreted tanks. Here finally the Panzer IV was the most numerous tank with 36%, followed closely by the Panzer III with 34.9%. Meanwhile, the Panther already makes up 11.6% in its first deployment. Now if we count also for Sturmgeschütze, Haubitzen, heavy tank destroyer, Sturmpanzers, flame tanks and captured T-34s, the situation looks a bit different. The percentages drop dramatically to just 25.7% for the Panzer IV and 25% for the Panzer III, since Sturmgeschütze und Sturmhaubitzen made up 19.9% of the armored fighting vehicles at Kursk. These are all based on the Panzer III chassis, by the way. Yet as you can see in both cases, the Panzer IV barely is the most numerous tank in the 5th year of the war. So what about 1944? Here we look at the Western Front for a change. In Normandy, according to Zetterlin, the Panzer IV was the most numerous tank with 841 versus 623 Panthers. So here, there's finally a clear lead for the Panzer IV. Yet if we compare it with the British numbers, we can see that the lead of the Panzer IV compared to the Sherman's lead is very limited when it comes to the ratio. On the 30th June 1944, there were more than 1,000 Sherman, including Fireflies, followed by the second most deployed British tank, the Cromwell, with about 250. Additionally, if we look at the cumulative production numbers of Panthers in 1944, the Panther actually is produced in larger numbers. For 3,125 Panzer IVs, there were 3,777 Panthers produced. And if one looks at the organization in the Panzer Division 44 layout, there were 2 tank battalions, one with Panzer IVs and one with Panthers. The total number differs slightly though, with 78 Panzer IVs and 73 Panthers. If we add command tanks, it is 83 versus 79. So in summer 1944, the Panzer IV is ahead, but at the same time the decision was made to discontinue the production of the Panzer IV and instead produce tank destroyers with its chassis. Yet later another decision was made, namely that the Panzer IV was not the tank nor chassis of choice. The decision was made to continue 2 tank chassis, and those were the Panther and Panzer 38T chassis, not the Panzer IV. Now one might argue, but maybe the chassis production of the Panzer IV had the lead, so with vehicles like assault guns, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery and similar vehicles, it might have a significant lead. Well, the short answer is nope, it actually falls behind. So let us add up the numbers here. Let us start with the Panzer III chassis vehicles. In total about 9,200 Sturmgeschütze III were built, then about 1,300 Sturmhaubitzen and 100 Flammpanzer, although they might have been converted. Based on the Panther IV chassis were the Sturmgeschütz IV with about 1,100, the Sturmpanzer IV with about 166, the Jagdpanzer IV with almost 2,000, and 540 Flakpanzer. Let us be generous here and also count the Hornisse/Nashorn and the Hummeln as well, with about 500 and 710 vehicles. Note, strictly speaking, those chassis were the Geschützwagen III, IV, which is a mixture of the Panzer III and IV chassis, but in terms of looks, it is more like a Panzer IV. Still, this gives a total of about 5,000 vehicles. As you can clearly see, we have double the amount of Panzer III chassis than IV here. To summarize, although the idea that the Panzer IV was the workhorse of the Wehrmacht sounds nice and convincing at first, it doesn't hold up if one looks at the numbers. At first it seems correct because one thinks the Panzer IV is a well-balanced tank and it was there from the beginning to the end of the war. Yet this is a rather superficial look at history. The problem is, in the beginning of the war the numbers were too low and they did not increase rapidly neither. In the first 2 years the Panzer II was the workhorse. Then it was the Panzer III. Only once production switched to the long-barreled 75mm gun, the Panzer IV increased substantially in importance. Yet that was for a short time and the numbers were also rather low initially. Theoretically I would say the Panzer IV should have been the workhorse of the Wehrmacht. But as these numbers show, it was not, and that is probably the main issue. The Wehrmacht did not have a workhorse like the T-34 or Sherman that the Allies had. So why is this important at all? To point out that the Panzer IV was not the workhorse of the Wehrmacht. Well, there are several reasons here. First, it's clearly incorrect. Namely to imply that the Panzer IV was the backbone of the German panzer forces, similar to the T-34 for the Soviets or the Sherman for the United States. This leads to the next point. Second, on the industrial scale, the term would suggest that Germany mass-produced the Panzer IV, which would have allowed a far more efficient production. Third, this mass production misconception also gives the impression that the German industry and/or tank production direction was streamlined to a degree it was not. As you can see, there is no clear numerical dominance of a tank like for the US Army or the Red Army. In terms of chassis, there is a dominance of the Panzer III, but even that is not as clear-cut. There's a bit of a caveat here, since the Panzer III and IV shared many parts like tracks, and with the exception of the early variants, also the same engine. As such, there were mass production benefits. While for the Sherman there were several types of engine used, so both diesel and gasoline, and of the latter, radial, multi-back and other engines. Additionally, there were Shermans with cast hulls and some with welded. Yet the Panzer IV also saw a lot of changes. As so often, the more details someone accounts for, the more complicated it gets. Anyway, fourth, on the tactical level, this means the Germans on the Eastern Front were facing the T-34s from 1941 to 1943 with mostly the Panzer III, not the Panzer IV with the long-barreled 75mm gun. Which raises a few more questions, but that is something for the future. Yet I have a final point here. When a few years ago I compared the Panzer III and T-34, quite many people complained that I should have compared the Panzer IV with the T-34, since the Panzer III versus T-34 was unfair in their opinion. Thank you to the Panzermuseum Munster for inviting me. Thank you to Jens Wehner for the idea and some data. Thank you to Roman Töppel for helping out with the questions about Kursk. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you for watching and see you next time.